I sat there frozen, the words still echoing in my mother's voice, trembling, disbelieving. You bought Graybridge. The same company that had fired her, the empire she'd worshipped for decades, was now mine. The porch light flickered between us, catching the shock in her eyes and the storm in mine. For years, she told me dreams were dangerous, but tonight, everything she believed in had collapsed with a single sentence. But what happened next would shatter even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. I still remember the way my mom, Linda, looked at me across the kitchen table that night. Arms crossed, lips tight, her voice slicing through the air like a verdict. It wasn't anger in her eyes, not exactly. It was worse. It was disappointment, sharpened by fear. The kind of fear that makes people cling to what they know, even when what they know is slowly suffocating them. You're wasting your life, Rachel. You had a real job at Graybridge Solutions, and now, you're playing pretend with your silly little app. The words fell heavy, deliberate, measured. Each syllable felt like a door closing. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't need to. My mother had a way of making silence louder than any argument. She built her life on order and predictability, on doing what was expected, never what was dreamed. She'd raised me to believe that ambition was dangerous, that risk was reckless, that stability was the highest virtue a woman could aim for. And in her world, Graybridge Solutions was the temple of that stability. She had been there since before I was born. I'd grown up watching her leave every morning at 7, coffee in hand, crisp blouse, ID badge swinging from her neck like a medal of honor. I used to think she ran the world, but over time I realized she didn't run anything, she endured it. She was the cog that never stopped turning, the dependable worker who outlasted everyone else because she never dared to imagine life beyond the company walls. So when I told her I was quitting my marketing job to build something of my own, to create LoopLink, a platform to help small businesses connect directly with loyal customers, she looked at me like I'd lost my mind. You're throwing away everything for some startup nonsense. To her, that word, startup, meant immaturity, foolishness, rebellion without cause. It wasn't that she wanted to hurt me. She honestly believed she was protecting me from the humiliation of failure. She believed that the safest life was the one that stayed small. But I couldn't accept that. I wanted more than safety. I wanted freedom, to create, to fail, to rise again on my own terms. I wanted to wake up knowing my effort built something real, not just another quarterly report buried under corporate jargon. I wanted to feel alive, not employed. Yet every dream I spoke aloud was met with another jab. You're almost 30, Rachel. You think people will take you seriously with that laptop in a coffee shop? When are you going to stop pretending to be some kind of entrepreneur? You're not like those people you see on TV. You don't have investors or money or connections. She said these things casually over breakfast, while folding laundry, while washing dishes, each remark disguised as concern, but I heard the contempt in every syllable. Her words lodged in my chest like splinters, and I carried them everywhere I went. Still, I refused to give up. I worked from dawn until exhaustion blurred the lines on the screen. My apartment was small, the rent barely manageable, my meals often instant noodles or whatever I could stretch from the grocery store discount bin. The glow from my laptop became my only light most nights, and yet, beneath all the fatigue and uncertainty, there was a strange kind of fire, something that felt purer than any paycheck I'd ever earned. I remember one night especially. I'd been awake for 20 hours debugging code, fighting back tears after a potential investor ghosted me at the last minute. I stared at my reflection in the dark laptop screen, tired eyes, unwashed hair, hope fading, and I thought about her words, "You're wasting your life." For a moment I believed her. I almost shut the whole thing down. But then I thought about the shop owners who told me how much they struggled, small family businesses losing loyal customers because they couldn't compete with big corporations. I remembered the look in their eyes when I explained what LoopLink could do for them. That hope, that belief, became my fuel. If I could help them survive, maybe I could prove that dreams weren't foolish after all. Every time I doubted myself, I heard her voice in my head, stern and cold, and it pushed me harder. It wasn't hate that drove me. It was the need to be seen, to be understood, to finally make her proud in my own way. But the gap between us widened. Phone calls turned into arguments. Dinners ended with slammed doors. She'd say, "You used to be sensible," and I'd snap back, "You used to believe in me." Eventually, we stopped talking about my work altogether. She'd pretend not to notice when I brought my laptop home. I'd pretend not to notice the disapproval etched into her face. And yet deep down, I still loved her fiercely. That's what made it so painful. I knew her judgments came from fear, the same fear that had kept her chained to the same desk for decades. She didn't hate my ambition, she just didn't understand it. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes when the person you love most becomes the loudest voice of doubt in your head. You start to wonder if they see something you can't. You start to question whether chasing your dream is worth losing their approval. But some part of me, the part she accidentally helped forge, refused to surrender. Her skepticism became my shadow and my strength at once. I couldn't silence her voice, so I decided to answer it the only way I knew how, through success. I didn't want revenge. I wanted validation. For her, for me, for every person told they were foolish for dreaming too big. What I didn't know then was that one day her world, the one she believed was unshakable, would crumble. And mine, the one she dismissed as fantasy, would rise in its place. But that reckoning would come later. For now, all I had was a flickering screen, an empty wallet, and a promise to myself that I would prove her wrong. Not out of spite, but out of love. 2 years later, our roles reversed. Only neither of us knew it yet. I didn't wake up to a trumpet blast or a headline declaring a new era. The shift arrived quietly, like a change in air pressure before a storm. The signs were subtle, then unmistakable. A calendar filling with product demos instead of job interviews. A bank account that no longer hovered on the edge of zero. A team Slack that buzzed through the night with ideas worth losing sleep over. Still, at home, I kept everything wrapped in careful modesty. Because triumph spoken too soon felt like tempting fate. And because I knew one stray sentence could crack open a conversation I wasn't ready to have with my mother. By then, LoopLink had learned to breathe on its own. We built a spine of features small businesses actually used instead of the shiny nonsense they nod at and ignore. Punchcard loyalty made digital and not creepy. Geofence thank you messages that felt human, not automated. A feedback loop that turned a one-star rant into a private conversation, and often a second chance. We started with a neighborhood coffee cart in Riverdale. Within months, we were onboarding a row of mom-and-pop shops along Maple Avenue like a chain of lights flicking on at dusk. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. A bakery noticed Tuesday morning walk-ins doubled. A barbershop tracked no-shows dropping by a third. A boutique stopped guessing which Instagram ad mattered and started measuring who actually came back. When we expanded to 3 cities, we did it the way normal people move apartments, one heavy box at a time, grunting, improvising, cursing gently, then laughing when it finally fit. A scrappy install team, laptops and backpacks, borrowed Wi-Fi, laminated one-pagers stuck behind registers with blue painter's tape. I answered support tickets at midnight and investor emails at dawn. Major investment sounded so glossy in the press release. In reality, it felt like oxygen arriving in the room a second before you black out. The term sheet came from a partner named Ethan Collins, all cufflinks and soft questions. What's the retention curve at day 90? Show me cohort behavior when you add SMS. I learned to answer without apology, to slide charts across the table with hands that didn't shake. We closed, we hired. We set up a second server cluster and pretended we'd always known what we were doing. I didn't tell my mom. Pride was the flimsiest reason, fear the truest. I could already hear her flattening the news. Venture money isn't real money. Startups crash all the time. Call me when it's profitable. I wanted to show her the final painting, not the messy brushstrokes. So I bit my tongue, smiled when she asked if I was still on that project, and took another plate to the sink. Then came the call. Graybridge is downsizing, she said, her voice trembling. They're cutting half the staff. My position's been eliminated. There was a hollow on the other end of the line. Not silence, but a room suddenly emptied of furniture. My mother had always been the metronome in our lives. Steady beat, steady breath, steady income. Hearing her sound small, not sharp, not commanding, not even angry, just small, knocked something out of alignment inside me. She repeated the phrase again like it would dissolve if she kept it moving. My position's been eliminated, as if the grammar itself were a mercy. I asked questions that didn't matter. How many, what timeline, what severance? Because the real question lodged behind my ribs. Who are you if the badge is gone? For decades, she'd been the one in control, I thought, watching my reflection in the darkened office window. Now her voice cracked like a child's. I gave them my best years, she added, so quietly I almost missed it. And they let me go like I was nothing. I pressed my forehead to the glass to cool the heat in my eyes. I wanted to say, now you understand, the raw, skinless feeling of being measured and found unnecessary. But the sentence tasted like gloating, and I couldn't feed that to a woman who had just been told she no longer belonged anywhere she recognized. So I listened. I asked if she'd eaten. I promised to come by. She said no, not tonight. She needed to think. What she meant was, she needed to sit with a life that wouldn't obey her anymore. Behind the scenes, fate was stitching its grim symmetry. Graybridge, her fortress of pride, had been bleeding quietly for years. When I'd worked there, before I jumped, I'd seen the decay dressed up as policy. The mainframe no one dared touch. The data warehouse held together by scripts named after the programmers' pets. Monthly innovation town halls, where someone inevitably recommended a new poster about teamwork. The executives swapped strategy decks like children trading baseball cards, shiny, irrelevant, full of fantasy stats. When real answers hurt, they scheduled another off-site. They confused endurance with excellence. Clients felt it first. Contracts that once renewed themselves started asking hard questions. Why are your insights late? Why is your dashboard down on the last day of the quarter? Why is your pricing structure a labyrinth? Competitors with cleaner code and fewer fossils under the floorboards smiled politely and took their lunch. In conference rooms with stale muffins, I'd watched middle managers rebrand failure as learning cycles. Meanwhile, good analysts left. The ones who stayed learned to survive by shrinking. The data department, my mom's pride, became an island of spreadsheets, a place you sent questions to die in pivot tables. Each quarter, they kept up the illusion by measuring only what they could still count. Hiring froze, then seeped. The morning mail card arrived lighter. HR stopped replacing chairs with broken cylinders. The plants in the lobby yellowed. I remember the day the help desk removed the color printers and wheeled in a single monochrome unit under a laminated sign. Please consider the environment before printing. Everyone pretended it was ecological. Everyone knew it was financial. Culture is the sum of things a company refuses to admit. And still, my mother had believed. Because belief had been her shelter, work hard, be loyal, and the universe keeps its side of the bargain. She had built her whole identity on that transaction. She couldn't see it failing because then she'd have to admit the bargain had always been imaginary. In the weeks before the call, I noticed little changes in her tone. She'd mentioned a senior VP named Mark Henley who used to stop by the floor and had suddenly vanished into consultancy. She'd say procurement was streamlining vendors, which meant the coffee in the break room tasted like regret. She mentioned a new system called Atlas that didn't integrate with anything, so people exported reports, cleaned them in Excel, and re-imported them as if they'd achieved modernity by hand. And meanwhile, LoopLink kept climbing. Not explosively. I never trusted rocket metaphors, but steadily, like a careful mountaineer testing every ledge. We hit a moment when churn shrank below 5%, and I printed the graph and taped it to the wall we still hadn't painted. Our dev lead, Maya, finally killed the bug that double-sent coupons when a user crossed a zip code boundary. Leo, our sales guy with the tired smile, landed a chain of 6 bakeries after he rewrote the deck overnight to speak fluent flour and ovens. On Fridays, I bought the team tacos with my own card, not a corporate account, and they tasted like dignity. I could have told my mom then. I could have said, we expanded to 3 cities. We landed a major investment. We're hiring. But timing has a moral dimension. When someone's house is burning, you don't show them blueprints for your new porch. So I kept it close. I sent her job postings, offered to read her resume, asked if she wanted me to connect her with Ethan for networking. Framed it as general advice, not as proof that I had powerful people in my phone. She said she'd think about it. She hated asking for favors. Favors to her were IOUs stamped in shame. At night, I lay awake replaying that sentence. They let me go like I was nothing. I knew that ache. It's the throb under the skin when a gate slams and no one bothers to explain what disqualified you. I thought of every time she had called my company a phase, a hobby, a costume. Not with cruelty, with certainty. And I understood. Certainty is a drug, and withdrawal is brutal. Graybridge kept shrinking, even if the memo called it a strategic refocus. The weekly newsletter celebrated resilience, while the headcount tracker slid down like a curtain. People who had given decades packed their lives into copy paper boxes. Security badges deactivated at noon flashed red on turnstiles, and grown adults learned to pretend that the beep didn't sound like judgment. Meanwhile, and I write this with no glee, only clarity, my little startup was thriving. We weren't immune to fear, we'd simply learned to metabolize it into momentum. We shipped faster than we apologized. We kept our promises small and our delivery precise, and somewhere between the worn carpet of a strip mall tailor shop and the clean glow of our latest deployment, I felt a new certainty spring up. Not the brittle kind that sneers at risk, but the quiet kind that survives it. I still didn't tell my mother. I wasn't hiding a victory. I was protecting its shape until it could stand on its own. A few months later, I was invited to a private investment meeting. The email was short, the kind that carries gravity without ornament: closed session, portfolio consolidation, potential strategic acquisition. It was from Ethan Collins, the partner who'd led our last round. The location read like a dare, a glass-walled conference room on the 49th floor that seemed to float above the river, the kind of place where cities are discussed like chessboards. I arrived early and stood by the window, hands on the cool steel rail, watching barges inch along the water like patient punctuation marks. When the door clicked, I turned to find Ethan and his second partner, Marissa Lane, already flipping through a thin blue folder with TONFIDENTIAL stamped in red. No small talk. Just the sound of paper and the hum of air conditioning that always seems a few degrees too cold in rooms where money makes decisions. "We have a company we'd like you to consider acquiring," Marissa said, sliding the folder across the table. "Strong client list, legacy contracts, clunky tech stack. You know the type. They're in receivership, assets being auctioned. We think LoopLink could extract meaningful value." I'd opened the folder and read the name. Graybridge Solutions. For a second I thought I'd misread. The fonts were ordinary, the ink dry. The universe rarely bothers with lightning bolts when a whisper will do. I read it again. Graybridge. My stomach tightened, not from fear, but from the sudden alignment of 1,000 stray moments into one coherent line. If fate had a signature, it looked a lot like a legal watermark. "Take your time," Ethan said, though his watch was already judging the room. I didn't need time. I needed quiet. I let my thumb press the folder's edge until the paper flexed. Graybridge had been my mother's cathedral, my own purgatory, and now, it seemed, a salvage yard. The briefing was clinical. Balanced sheets slumped like tired shoulders. Deferred maintenance had matured into full-blown rot. Their innovation budget was a rounding error. Their cloud migration was a promise with dust on it. They were solvent on paper until you looked beneath the footnotes, where reality had been amortized into oblivion. The receiver had a deadline. The assets, customer lists, software licenses, a trademark with some dusted credibility, would be sold within 3 weeks. The asking price? Less than what we'd raised in our last funding round. Less than the value of our quarter's ARR. "Why me?" I asked, though I already knew. "Because you're positioned to make the assets useful," Marissa said. "And because you know where the bodies are buried." I gave a tight smile. I prefer the term legacy systems. Due diligence moved like a metronome in a minor key. Our counsel, Brad Whitaker, scheduled calls, drafted memos, highlighted liabilities the color of arterial blood. I redlined items that felt like personal archaeology: vendor contract, Hudson Analytics, terminated, maintenance agreement, Atlas ETL, non-compliant, lease for Suite 12B, abandoned. I could see the corridors as I read them. The carpet that always snagged on heels outside Conference C, the ficus that turned brown every winter and was reborn each spring in a new pot, the elevator that sighed before it opened like a reluctant host. On day 3, we got the data room login. Behind the password lay a museum of decisions, PDFs of board minutes thick with euphemisms, strategic pause where things had actually stalled, resourcing adjustments where people had been erased. There were dashboards from 2019 that still celebrated a record pipeline, and emails from last quarter quietly asking if the copier lease could be renegotiated. I found an org chart and traced my mother's function with a finger: data services, operations, performance reporting. An island labeled with titles that were once currencies: senior specialist, principal analyst, director, acting. So many ways to say stay still. We inspected the code. Maya skimmed classes like a forensic linguist, muttering, "Monolith, hard-coded business logic, no unit tests, ETL jobs stitched nightly by Cron and Hope." She looked up. It's salvageable if we treat it like a donor program, not a patient. We transplant what we need, retire the rest. A week into diligence, the receiver's attorney, Carolyn Finch, efficient as a paperclip, hosted a call that sounded like a countdown. Offers will be accepted on a rolling basis, with preference given to clean terms, she said, barely disguising relief at anyone willing to make this her problem no longer. Clean terms meant cash. No contingencies, no hero fantasies about restructuring. Buy it, take it, fix it yourself. The number we offered was both generous and practical, enough to move us to the front, not enough to make us sentimental. We attached a list of assets we'd accept and liabilities we would not, a scalpel instead of a net. On Friday at 4:12 p.m., Caroline emailed a single sentence. Your offer has been accepted. Please expect the purchase agreement shortly. That was the moment I exhaled. Not triumph, not vengeance, just a click in the lock. Signing happened in a quiet room that smelled faintly of lemon polish, the kind of room courthouses reserved for business that prefers not to be seen. Rad slid papers toward me one after another with a dry elegance that made law look like ballet. I initialed margins until my name looked unreal. Rachel L. Carter, Rachel L. Carter, Rachel L. Carter. Somewhere in the building next door, a clock struck the hour. When the final page came, I didn't hesitate. My signature moved steadily to the end of the sentence history had started without asking me. It wasn't revenge. Not yet. It was closure, the rare kind that happens on ledger lines, decimal points aligning where old wounds used to throb. The check cleared, the stamp landed, the file closed with a satisfied, almost domestic thud. A week later, I drove my Tesla, bought with startup profits and still smelling faintly of new leather and determination, across town to my mom's house. The car's cabin hummed like a sealed promise. Streetlights took turns sliding across the windshield. Every red light felt like a breath held. I remembered sitting in her set-in as a kid, the dashboard ticking warm, radio low, her hand reaching for mine before big school days. It is strange which details the heart keeps, the crinkle of the job classifieds in her lap, the way she folded newspaper edges into crisp triangles, the peppermint gum she always offered before I made any presentation, as if mint could armor the truth. She was on the porch when I pulled up, a sweater around her shoulders though the evening wasn't cold, reading job listings in the paper, the same font, the same cadence of hurt and hope, the very pages she once waved at me like rules. The porch light cast a ring around her like a stage mark. She looked up, then down again, as if the act of being seen felt indecent. You'll find something soon, I said, leaning against the railing because sitting made the words too formal. The sentence was true and useless, a bandage for a fracture. At my age, no one hires 50-year-olds, Rachel. She didn't say it with bitterness, just with the weary accuracy of someone who has read too many postings that want digital natives and the stamina of a machine. I took a deep breath and felt the weight of two lives balance on it, the old script and the new one unsaid between us. The porch creaked softly, a witness. A moth battered the light globe, a tiny insistence on the possibility of warmth. Maybe, I began, let the word hang, chose something steadier. Maybe I will. She blinked. Her eyes moved from my face to the car to the paper and back. What are you talking about? I smiled, the kind of calm smile that hides a storm of history, a smile I'd practiced in rooms where I wasn't expected to belong. I wasn't gloating. I was declaring jurisdiction over my own narrative. Mom, I said, letting each syllable settle, I just bought Graybridge Solutions. The sentence landed between us like a key on a table, small, metallic, undeniable. The porch light hummed. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked at nothing. My mother's gaze didn't move for a breath, then two. The newspaper slipped a fraction in her lap, print blurring where her thumb pressed too hard. I didn't add anything else. I began to outline what with might look like, careful to keep it human, not transactional. You know how people fit, I said. Who needs a nudge and who needs air? You can read a room before anyone speaks. Graybridge forgot the difference between process and punishment. You never did. Her eyes flicked to mine with a startle of recognition, not of flattery, but of being accurately seen. She looked away, toward the head she trimmed into obedience every spring. I don't want to be a mascot, she said, the old steel edging back in. I don't want pity. I don't want to be trotted out as a redemption story. I'm not hiring a symbol, I said. I'm asking for a partner. What would I even do? The question arrived defensively, but its core was honest inquiry. People operations, I answered. Not HR the way Graybridge made it. A maze that tired people out until they quit asking. Actual care. Systems that work because they make sense, not because they're enforced. Hiring, onboarding, training that doesn't humiliate. Policies that say what they mean and do what they promise. You always had the instincts, now I can give you the authority to match them. A flicker crossed her face, memory, maybe of younger years when she proposed something sensible that died in a committee because a VP didn't like admitting a secretary had noticed what he hadn't. She swallowed. Do I report to you? We report to the work, I said. But yes, technically. And you'll have the power to tell me when I'm wrong. Will you listen? I didn't buy Graybridge to replace one stubborn regime with another. She breathed out a sound that this time was a laugh. You always did hate paperwork. I hate paperwork that's bad at being paper, I said. The kind that's theater. Her eyes lifted fully then, pupils dark in the porch light, assessing me the way she used to assess a new supervisor, a new budget, a new winter coat. Not for how it looked, but for whether it would hold. You sound like a person I could work with, she said slowly, deliberately returning the preposition to me like a corrected test. I'd like that, I said. A breeze stirred the newspaper into a sigh. She reached for the edge and smoothed it. A small act of control returned to her hands. There are people, she said carefully, who were good there, who tried, who will take this harder than I did. I know, I said, and left it at that. No promises I couldn't ethically make tonight. No strategies that belonged to mornings. What mattered now was the bridge between her world and mine and whether it could carry both of us without splintering. Rachel, she said after a pause, my name fitted with a softness I hadn't heard since the year I broke my arm, and she slept on the carpet beside my bed for 4 nights. I don't know how to be proud of this without hating myself a little. I spent years telling you not to become what you became. You taught me to be thorough, I said. So be thorough with pride. Make room for the parts of you that were wrong and the parts that were right. She studied me like a map that finally matched the road. You sound older, she said. So do you, I answered. She wiped the last wetness from her cheek with the back of her hand, utilitarian, unceremonious. When she spoke again, her voice had steadied into a new register. Not command, not capitulation, something like agreement. If we do this, she said, we do it clean. Titles that mean what they say. Pay that matches the work. No meetings that exist to prove meetings exist. Deal, I said. And you'll let me throw out forms that ask for information no one reads. I smiled. I'll like the shredder. Another silence came, but now it felt shared rather than barbed. The moth finally gave up on the porch light and drifted into the dark where real stars lived. Inside, the clock kept its small law. A car passed, headlights moving like a slow thought across the siding. My mother reached for my hand. Not a dramatic clasp, just a steady touch, as if confirming I was not a mirage assembled by stress and evening. For the first time, I thought with a clarity that made my chest ache, she's not trying to fix a daughter, she's measuring a woman. Respect traveled across her palm into mine, unassuming and irrevocable. Okay, she said, and the word opened a door that had been painted shut for years. Okay. 6 months later, Graybridge by Looplink had become a name people said without wincing. The emails that used to begin with apologies started arriving with requests. The introductions that once sounded like disclaimers now landed like credentials. We didn't change the world. We changed the habits that made worlds. That proved enough. We began by rehiring people, not ghosts. Half the old staff returned through a door that no longer required a bowed head. We interviewed deliberately, seat by seat. No grand gestures. No pity hires. We asked the only question that mattered. What can you do when the process stops pretending and starts telling the truth? The ones who had survived the previous regime by going quiet almost frightened me with the precision of their observations once we let them speak. A payroll specialist named Joyce described a reconciliation loop that could be cut from 3 days to 4 hours if we stopped forcing reports through a legacy connector no one trusted. A junior analyst called Marcus explained that the weekly metrics meeting produced 15 slides and 0 decisions because the deck answered questions no one had asked. We cut that meeting and replaced it with a 20-minute huddle that ended with exactly 3 owners and 3 deadlines. Candor, given oxygen, multiplied. Modernizing the systems wasn't a parade of buzzwords. It was a sequence of disciplined repairs. We moved the data warehouse from its labyrinthine on-prem fortress to a cloud stack that scaled without begging. ETL jobs moved from cron-tab superstition to scheduled pipelines with tests that failed loudly before a client ever noticed. We pried business logic out of the app like calcified barnacles, put it where it belonged, and wrote documentation that didn't require translation by a priesthood of senior engineers. Uptime, once a brittle boast, became a baseline. 6 months in, we posted 99.95% without drama. SLAs turned from legal shields into operational promises. Revenue followed reliability, not the other way around. Churn fell from a punitive 14% to 4.7% once we stopped treating customer support like a confessional and started treating it like a diagnostic. We didn't delight users, we made their problems go away on the first ticket. Our sales decks lost weight. Fewer adjectives, more timelines. We priced by outcomes rather than features, which meant procurement stopped arguing about line items and started nodding at projected lift. The first profitable month arrived like a dawn. Pale, then bright enough that no one could pretend it hadn't happened. And my mom, she ran human resources, efficiently, compassionately, humbly. And it changed the texture of the building more than any fresh paint. She took the department sign off the wall and replaced it with a small plaque that read People Operations. Not because the term was fashionable, but because it clarified the work. People, operating. The old forms that asked for information no one read went into the shredder she kept by her desk like a pet. She instituted a rule that sounded like a joke until it saved us hours. If you need more than 2 workflows to explain a policy, the policy is a bad policy. Exit interviews moved from last rites to discovery sessions. Within 2 months we had a list of 10 preventable frictions and the order in which to fix them. We paid market on time with clean math. Titles matched responsibilities. Promotions required evidence you could show to a stranger with eyes. Compassion wasn't a memo, it was her posture. When a team lead botched a rollout and wanted to resign rather than face the room, she sat with him until his breathing slowed and then walked him into the debrief, one hand on the door, and opened with, "Tell us what you tried to do and where the plan drifted. Not why did you fail, where did the plan drift?" That one sentence kept 3 people from quitting that quarter. When an hourly employee asked for a late start every other Friday because she cared for her father, my mom didn't make a spectacle of leniency. She reworked the schedule template so the exception became a supported pattern. People started using PTO without shame. The office got quieter, not because morale dipped, but because urgency stopped performing itself. Sometimes I'd catch her looking at me during meetings, a little smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. It never arrived at the punchline of a grin. It hovered in the territory between pride and relief. I knew what it meant. It wasn't just pride. It was gratitude, not for being rescued, but for a second career built on her first principles, finally given authority. She'd had spent years enforcing rules designed to keep lawyers calm. Now she got to write rules that kept people whole. The alignment restored something in her posture that had bent under decades of maybe later. We built rituals that taught without announcing themselves as culture. Every Monday began with a 6-slide state of the work: revenue, uptime, top 3 risks, top 3 mitigations, 1 customer story that wasn't sanitized for marketing. Every Friday ended with Fix It at the Source, 15 minutes where anyone could nominate an annoyance and a small squad raised their hands to erase it the following week. The company began to hum at a frequency that sounded like competence. The office itself learned new manners, the lobby plants stopped dying. The break room became a place to refuel rather than a battlefield of passive-aggressive sticky notes. Our Slack #thanks channel filled with specifics instead of platitudes. Shout out to Aditi for catching the null edge case in the loyalty accrual. Props to Lewis for resequencing the onboarding emails and shaving a day off time to first value. Appreciation for Alina from payroll who noticed the overtime calculation mismatch before it hit paychecks. Gratitude, when anchored to detail, trains excellence. We told the Graybridge story without flinching or gloating. At the all-hands where we unveiled the new brand mark, the old serif softened into a modern face that nodded to what came before. I said, "We did not buy a trophy. We adopted a responsibility." My mom stood beside me and introduced a policy we drafted together, a compact of clarity. "If a rule doesn't help you do better work," she said, "it will be amended or removed. You have my email." She meant it. The inbox filled, then leveled, because when people see their feedback move the furniture, they stop shouting and start participating. The profitability line turned from rumor to report. Our board meetings shifted from can they survive to where should they choose to grow. But the numbers never felt like the story's most important chapter. The story that mattered unfolded in small, precise victories, an implementation that went live on a Wednesday with 0 rollbacks, a former Graybridge client emailing to say the new dashboard finally speaks English, a department that had confused exhaustion with excellence discovering that rest plus boundaries equals better output. One evening, after everyone had gone home and the building settled into the soft creaks that happen when HVAC takes a breath, my mom came into my office. She didn't knock. She never had in our kitchen at home and had decided some customs deserved tenure. The window showed the city in checklist lights. On my desk, a mug with the ring of a day's work at its rim, a neat pile of resumes she'd anonymized for a hiring manager who needed to stop equating charisma with skill. You know, she said softly, standing instead of sitting, hands wrapped around her own elbows as if warming them. I used to think I was protecting you by discouraging you. I just didn't want you to struggle like I did. Her voice carried neither defense nor theater. It was the tone of a ledger reconciled at last. I turned the chair and faced her fully. She wore one of her calm blouses, the pale blue kind that makes honesty easier. Her hair, streaked silver in a way that refused apology, framed a face that had learned to relax without surrendering authority. I smiled. You didn't stop me, Mom. You just made me stronger. She laughed through her tears, that unguarded, almost surprised laugh that crests when sorrow realizes it has company. Guess I raised a CEO after all. Not just a CEO, I said, and I meant it as a record more than a compliment. You raised someone who knows that work is about keeping promises, to customers, to colleagues, to yourself. She wiped the corner of her eye with her thumb and looked around my office as if it were a room in a house we'd both somehow built. On the wall hung the first LoopLink contract we'd signed in Riverdale, framed not because it was lucrative, but because it had been brave. Next to it, a copy of the compact she'd written, printed on plain white paper without any calligraphy. She noticed, smiled, and shook her head like a woman who'd finally gotten the scissors she needed after decades of using a butter knife. We didn't hug like movie credits. We stood in the comfortable silence of people who understand that victory worth keeping is quieter than the world expects. Outside, the city ran its late shift. Inside, our servers purred toward morning. Graybridge by LoopLink wasn't a miracle. It was a long, careful answer to every doubt, every sigh, every be realistic that meant be small. The lesson wasn't complicated. It was just earned. Build the thing that works, treat people like adults, and let respect do the heavy lifting.